I don't know if you've ever heard of the ministry Answers in Genesis, but we grew
No.
up. Okay, so have you heard of the Creation Museum in Kentucky?
Yes, I
They are the
have.
people behind the Creation Museum. They're
And
the people
the
behind
Ark.
the Noah's Ark experience.
Oh no, Ark
Oh yeah.
experience. Oh
Mm-hmm.
no. This podcast was sponsored by King James and the 12 Disciples. Just kidding. Thank you so much for joining me on Growing Up Fundie, the podcast where we talk about religious experiences, religious upbringings, both normal and abnormal, and just kind of whatever else the conversation allows during the Q&A. So if you would like, Seth, feel free to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, where you're coming from, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, so my name is Seth Kays. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, but I moved to Nashville in 2012 for college. Went to Belmont University. Yeah, got my degree in audio engineering with a minor in film. And since then, I have been working all throughout the entertainment industry. Currently, I've been doing stand-up comedy for almost a year now.
Hell yeah.
I've been working in the film industry for the last 6 years, 7 years.
Wow.
Done some music work. I'm currently working on a scripted podcast, like an old school radio theater. So just any chance I can get in entertainment, I've been doing it over the last several years. It's been a good time.
That's awesome. That's really, really cool. So how does somebody go from being religious to doing like comedy and film and things that, for anybody who may not be involved in those things, are usually a very eccentric kind of scene? You know, there's usually everything that you're taught to avoid in the most religious teachings are present and celebrated in arts communities, I feel like a lot of times. So what is that like? How was that for you?
Well, so it's an interesting story how I got here. I grew up homeschooled from the get-go until I got to college. Literally didn't take any classes, like traditional classes, until I started doing dual enrollment my senior year of high school.
Wow.
So that being said, my parents have always loved entertainment, music, movies, stand-up comedy. I mean, I grew up listening to some of the, original greats like Bill Cosby before all that stuff went down. Bob Newhart, Bob Hope, the Marx Brothers, like Charlie Chaplin. Like I grew up on the most classic version of entertainment, and that itself kind of moved into, as I continued to grow up, a lot of Christian entertainment. And my parents have always been artistically inclined. My dad was a trumpet player when he was in high school. My mom is very gifted artistically, and she actually got us very involved in like competitive speech and debate.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So I did a lot of that. Read a lot of Shakespeare growing up. So I've had a lot of influences coming at me from all over the place. And it's all kind of just culminated when I finally moved here and realized that the thing that I love doing is creating, be it music, be it films, be it stand-up comedy, be it any of these things. I just like creating and telling stories through all these different mediums. So it's interesting that it was very encouraged growing up.
Yeah, it sounds like you had a 50-50 secular, non-secular.
Sort of. That's the interesting thing, because I didn't see a single Star Wars movie until I was 19. I never watched popular things growing up like Friends. I didn't see that till I got to college. Last night, I actually just watched an episode, like a full episode of Seinfeld for the first time. So
what did you think?
I was not a fan.
You're like, it was just okay. It was literally
it
just
was a
okay.
sitcom in the 90s. It was a thing. I've been watching Fresh Prince for the first time, and I've been enjoying that far more. So it's, I don't know,
Really?
yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that Will Smith came at it not from a comedian's standpoint, but he came at it from an actor's standpoint. I just feel like it
Yes.
felt a little more cohesive as a TV show like that. But yeah, so because of that, it's almost like I feel like I haven't had the nostalgia factor to
Yeah.
cloud my judgment on how I
Yeah.
view certain things like that. Because I mean, I hold the most unpopular opinion in the Star Wars fandom that A New Hope is the worst Star Wars movie ever.
I was gonna say, oh no, you're gonna get us both canceled. You're gonna get us both
probably.
canceled. That's great.
Get canceled by all the nerds, but
That's
it's
funny.
because I didn't grow up on it. I don't have that childhood filter to look at things, you know, outside of, is this artistically pleasing to me? Like, do I enjoy this or not?
Yeah.
So,
So
same thing with like music as well. Like I mostly grew up listening to Christian music,
right,
and didn't discover bands like Blink-182 until I was 17. So
interesting. So
yeah.
what first, I guess, what religion would you say that you identified with all those years? Are you religious now? And then what do you think it was about the belief system that allowed some entirely mainstream things to be perfectly okay and other mainstream things to be like Friends, for example? Because I can understand Star Wars, because some people, you know, they kind of jump on the witchcraft bandwagon or magic but Friends, like that just seems.
Well, yeah. So I guess to answer the questions in order, I grew up technically non-denominational, but my parents would also have identified us as charismatic, which a lot of times was described as like Pentecostal light. We believed in speaking in tongues, we believed in some things like that, but we never took it to a place that a lot of Pentecostals, like I know one of the big stereotypes for Pentecostals is like the snake ceremonies and stuff like that. Like we never did anything like that. I know.
I really want to get one of those people on this podcast, because I gotta know.
I would love to see that, because I have no experience in that part of it, but we did have a lot of deep spiritual beliefs as far as like spiritual warfare and demonic, you know, presences and that kind of stuff. I think even beyond what a lot of typical Christians would believe. At this point, I don't consider myself religious. I'm not opposed to the idea that there is some sort of God. I mean, I still just look at the world and look at the universe, and I'm so flabbergasted by just the amount of insanity that is all over the universe. And I'm just, if someone told me that aliens created Earth and that we were just some science experiment, I would almost consider that to be a type of God, like it's a creator.
Right.
So I wouldn't necessarily be surprised, but it's not like I'm hardcore believing in a God anymore. And so I feel like a lot of that has definitely influenced my artistic style and the way that I, you know, have chosen to get into entertainment. Because so you were asking about Friends. There were definitely some strange things that I saw my parents kind of pick and choose what they liked and didn't like growing up. My dad's favorite movie series is Rocky. And it's literally 9 movies at this point about 2 guys beating the crap out of each other in a boxing ring.
Right.
But I wasn't allowed to watch Braveheart because it was too violent. Yeah. And my parents were against shows like Friends because to them, it was basically a show about 20, 30-year-olds running around having sex all the time.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that like entire element of the show.
Yeah.
That's true. Like everybody was sleeping with everybody. So that makes sense.
Exactly. So to them, that wasn't necessarily family friendly. And it wasn't what they wanted to show us growing up, that it was just, you know, okay to date every person, every episode it was a new person.
It was. That's true.
And so I guess they didn't want us to have that kind of flippant view towards love and relationships. So again, it's like some of the things did make sense, as you know, because I have 5 siblings. So to them, it's like we've got 6 kids. We know they're all going to grow up being different people, but we still have our core values that we want to instill in them.
Right.
And so that's why I think they were very picky with the things that they chose to let us watch on TV or as movies. Again, like I said, some of it looking back didn't totally make sense, but other times I can look at it and be like, I actually understand where they were coming from, whether I agree with it now or not.
Right. Yeah. For example, when I was growing up, I was allowed to watch any movie that had won an Academy Award or been nominated for a bunch of Academy Awards. So like Saving Private Ryan, all those movies. But I remember my mom got really mad when my babysitter let us watch Night of the Roxbury, which is like that. Yeah, exactly. Or I wasn't allowed to watch like Ren and Stimpy, Beavis and Butthead, all those like really, cartoons. I didn't see The Simpsons until one day in high school, my senior year. My English teacher was going to play an episode of The Simpsons because it had something to do with the lesson we were talking about. Yeah. And I remember thinking like, oh my God, I'm going to be in so much trouble. My mom's going to find out I watched The Simpsons in this class. What's going on? And it was a really funny, intelligent episode.
Yeah.
And that's when I started to realize like, wait a second, maybe these are actually really good shows. What's going on? So I'm always interested to hear why people think that their parents like picked and chose certain media.
I mean, another good example of that is like growing up, I was not allowed to watch Harry Potter, but Lord of the Rings and Narnia was totally okay because those were Jesus magic.
Well, and I guess Chronicles of Narnia was, I think, based on the books, but based on the Bible. I mean, but I've never heard that Lord of the Rings was biblical. That's new.
Oh, absolutely. Tolkien was a massive Catholic. He actually is the one responsible for C.S. Lewis becoming a Catholic, who wrote Narnia.
Yeah, I knew he was a Christian. That's interesting. That's funny.
So...
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, I knew he was like like what you might consider a Catholic evangelical, if there is such a thing, but Orthodox maybe, is that I don't know if that's the correct term, but
possibly.
Wild. That's wild.
So that definitely influenced his writings, because literally Gandalf is supposed to be an angel sent to Middle Earth from, the Middle Earth god. Like there's all sorts of both religious and like Norse lore that he put into those writings. And so, it definitely influenced everything that he was doing.
Well, and I think it's cool that your parents at least did research before they banned you from, from watching something. So that's cool. Okay. So are your siblings and your family still pretty religious, or what is that dynamic like now that you consider yourself not religious?
For the most part, I would probably say no. I don't totally know about my oldest sister. I do actually have a trans sister, and I know that she is definitely not what you would consider religious. We're pretty much on the same page as far as that's concerned. My younger siblings, I think my little brother probably still is, to a point. He and I haven't really had a lot of conversations on that. Same with the older of my younger sisters. So I mean, I don't know. It's not something that we talk about a lot. It's not like it's an off limits topic, but it just isn't something that really
doesn't come up. Yeah. That doesn't seem like dinner conversation. So how do you feel about the afterlife?
But at the same time, my dad and I have had a lot of good conversations over the last couple of years, because he was the one who, I mean, his dad was in World War II. Like literally the only reason I'm here today is because my grandfather, a buddy of his, stepped on a landmine 2 weeks before D-Day. So because that happened, my grandfather got hit with shrapnel and was not able to go to D-Day. And so literally that's the reason I'm sitting here, is because my grandfather, due to an unfortunate accident, was not in D-Day. And so my dad has always said that he doesn't think he really knew his dad. He knew a very different shell of the man that he used to be, because of, I'm sure, the crazy things that he saw during World War II.
The trauma.
Yeah. So because of that, my dad definitely grew up with that kind of military man mentality, which for a while did influence his parenting style. But over the last couple of years, we've had some really good conversations where he's been able to understand not only the things that he did, whether he intended to or not, but just how, since leaving home and since going out on my own, I've been able to look at the world differently outside of that original bubble that I was in, and have come to my own thought out conclusions.
Interesting. That
Yeah.
is, and I think that's an interesting parallel that you make. I find also that there is oftentimes a link between people who are religious, people in the military, and then also I find typically it's also a more conservative household.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, there are liberal Christians. I don't want to, categorize everybody, but I find
Yeah.
statistically you are more likely to find that a military family who has a more conservative like upbringing is also very Christian. So I'm
Yeah.
curious which comes first. Does religion make you conservative, therefore like kind of sway you towards the military as like a career?
Yeah.
I'm always curious which comes first.
I mean, I've known a lot of people who have been in military families, and it seems like depending on how long your family's been involved in the military, I feel like that can affect it, because if we're talking from World War II on, chaplains were a huge part of being in the military, because it gave soldiers some sort of comfort, to be able to think about the fact that there could be an afterlife, that there is a God who is supposedly protecting you. And I feel like as time has gone on, as newer people have started joining the military outside of these like legacy families, you see a lot less of that coming through. And you start seeing a lot more people who are, like you said, are liberal or are not religious. But the people who have been in it for decades and decades and generations, I feel like that just kind of trickles through, because when you're raised that way and don't see outside that bubble, that's all you know.
Right. Exactly. That's just kind of what you're familiar with. Yeah. And especially when your parents raised you that way and their parents raised you that way, you just kind of, that's just your style. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just like an observation that I noticed. So about what age do you think you started to kind of question everything and maybe change your mind? Were you ever very devout yourself, or did you always have questions? What was that like?
Oh no, I was very devout. There literally was a point in time around when I was 16 or 17 that I could have made the choice to be a pastor, like to go that direction, because my dad he was a pastor years ago, and now he's just a general minister, which basically the difference is he doesn't have a church that he is specifically loyal to or working for. He does,
but he's freelance.
Basically, yeah. He has his own ministry. He's done tapes, and back when that was a thing, a lot of sermons that he has written and notes that he's done studying the Bible. And I think he actually still teaches kids church at the church that my family goes to. So yeah, like that, basically that.
And what do you think it was that made you initially kind of change your mind and question things, if you can remember?
Yeah, I don't know if it was anything specific, just kind of as I began to see more of the world itself and hear from opinions that weren't strictly Christian based. I want to say I was 23 or 24 when, because I grew up pretty creationist, and for the longest time the idea of evolution just was not compatible with my brain. And a lot of what you're told, and not even just from my parents but just from the Christian community in general, what you're told is oh, the science that proves evolution is junk science, it's all fake, there's nothing, carbon dating, that's not accurate at all. And then one day I was talking to a friend of mine about it, and that came up, and I said, oh, well, carbon dating is not accurate. And he's like, yeah, but we know how like elements like uranium break down over time, and so we can tell what has been around the longest because we can see how it's been affected by things outside of whatever I was told growing up. And I think at that moment, that's when it kind of clicked with me that, okay, even if there is a God, that doesn't mean that this other thing isn't true. And so I started looking into the arguments for evolution, and then found out that even the Catholic Church has accepted Darwin's theory of evolution since like the 1950s, 1960s. and was like, okay, this does kind of compute with me that if someone created this, maybe this was just the process that they created. And then,
Right. I've
yeah,
always wondered why there aren't more, or at least maybe there are and they're just not very loud about it, but why there aren't more widely publicized belief systems that concede God created the original form and that original form then evolved on the earth based
exactly.
on, I've always wondered that, because to me, especially back when I was my most about, that made perfect sense to me. Like
Yeah.
God invented the OG version of a koala back in the day. And then over time, you know, the continents separated, whatever, those
Yeah.
animals that he created then changed.
Exactly.
And I've always been curious why it has to be one or the other, and it can't be more of like a widely accepted.
I think recently it's become more accepted, because I still know a lot of people who hold strictly to it was 6 24-hour periods that God used to create the earth, even though I feel like most biblical scholars today will tell you, especially the book of Genesis, is more what is accepted as like biblical mythology,
right.
where it's like clearly no one who, like, because the first 5 books are written by Moses wasn't there for that.
Right.
Apparently God told him exactly what happened, but at the same time you look at it and it's clear he's using metaphor, because
right.
at that point in time a day wouldn't have been something. There was, light came before the sun, and the earth was not revolving around the sun at that point in time. So scientifically, no one would have known what a 24-hour day was.
Right.
And so a day, and there are literally verses in the Bible where it says that a day, to God is like 1,000 years to us. So
right.
why couldn't time have been more fungible in that account of the creation story?
Right. Exactly. I'm right there with you. And I think it's these kind of questions that people should feel more comfortable posing. I was talking to somebody last night who also grew up very conservatively religious in the South. And we were saying how many, many times not in all, but in many conservative religions, when you ask questions, it's taken as an attack.
Yeah.
As opposed to a teaching opportunity or a learning opportunity. And I think we should, if you are going to claim that you wholeheartedly believe something and you're going to base your life around that thing, I think it's a wise decision to promote research and thought. And because I feel like the best thing to help, say, proselytize Christianity would be to allow people to ask questions and to answer those questions for them. And then when you don't know the answer, to be like, I'm going to talk to my pastor about that, or I'm going to look that up and I'll get back to you. And then you get back to them with your thoughts or your findings. And so I've always wondered why that opportunity oftentimes kind of gets cut off at the knees with some religions that take that as the devil. And I remember a lot of times they would teach you that as you grow up and as you go into the world, the devil will send people to you to question your faith. And so when you're among entirely rational members of your group, your age group, and you're all hanging out and you're just talking and something like this comes up and they start asking you questions about why you believe certain things or why you think certain things are, your brain starts to say, oh, this is what they always warned me about. These are the demonic people trying to make me sway my faith. When in reality, it's good questions. It's
exactly.
It's questions that I think are really important. If you are going to dedicate your life to something like that, you need to know what it is you're dedicating your life to.
I agree. And I think, honestly, that's something my parents actually did really well, was they actively encouraged us to search for truth.
Yes.
And to ask because we were having this conversation over Christmas, and my dad was talking about how when he first got into the church, when he was like 16, 17, he would ask his pastor certain questions, and he started realizing how much his pastor would dodge certain questions.
Right.
And so I think that influenced my parents into wanting us to search for truth, which at the time to them, truth was the Bible and Jesus, and this is the truth.
Right.
They would always say, other religions and other people may have truth, but we have the truth.
Right.
And so to them, searching for truth was asking, intellectual questions to get to understand where the Bible was coming from or what we believe as far as Christianity is concerned. And I mean, that had a lot to do with the speech and debate that I did growing up, was they wanted to make sure that we knew how to find facts and find truth, be it when it came to what we believed as Christians or what we believed about the world in general.
Yes. What form of debate were you in?
I have done all sorts of forms of debate. So
Parley, LD.
I have done parliamentary debate. Just we would go to camps that were specifically for speech and debate, and they would have us try out different ones. But professionally, I did team policy, I did Lincoln Douglas, and I did public forum.
Nice. I did IPDA for years, novice, varsity, and pro level. But and I bring that up because I feel like debate was what really opened my eyes politically, socially, religiously. This idea that, at least in IPDA debate, you are given a topic, you are told whether you are for or against it. You don't get to pick. And then you have 30 minutes to do research. And I think it's this idea that every weekend I was forced to do research against what I thought I believed. And I was forced to defend it, that you start to, at first you're like, I'm just doing this for the round. This is dumb. But then you start to think and you're like, this is actually quite reasonable. This information makes a lot of, wait a second, this makes a lot of sense. And now that I'm saying it, I'm kind of on board with it now. Do you feel like that had any kind of influence in that way on you, or was it just performative mostly?
No, absolutely it did. So most of what I did was team policy debate. And the way that one worked is you had a resolution for the entire year, and you could pick whatever you wanted to talk about under that resolution. And the year that I actually ended up going to nationals, our resolution was that the US should change its foreign policy towards India. And so not only did you have to figure out what you wanted to do when you were on the affirmative team, but it would flip-flop back and forth, and you would be affirmative, sometimes you would be negative. And so you would have to go up against someone else's case and already have pre-researched evidence to go against what they were talking about.
Right.
So in addition to having, an entire box full of evidence supporting our case, we had 2 to 3 times that amount of information against everything, because we were researching so many other cases that people were doing throughout the years. And so by that point, I mean, I still know random facts about India that I have no business knowing, just because I went into our nuclear treaties with India, the way that we deal with India when it comes to the stock market, oil deals that we have, like all sorts of random stuff, the caste system. Like I learned all about this stuff because I was researching against what other people were trying to bring up as their own cases.
Yes. I love having a treasure trove of useless current event facts from 2010 to 2014. Like I can't tell you much about anything else, but I can tell you, hey, did you know in 2014 Uzbekistan did this thing? But I think it's very interesting. And I think a lot of times I've noticed there is a pattern where particularly in the South, in America, people are raised conservatively religious, or maybe not in their mind. Like I don't consider myself, having grown up, fundamentalist at all. Very much like you, we were non-denominational, kind of identified mostly as Baptist. But still, in comparison to who I am now, I would call it conservative. And I've found that there is definitely a link between people who, particularly in the South, were raised very religious on the conservative spectrum. And the way that they start to question things is when they kind of move away and experience new things and new people. I feel like that changes religious, political, and I feel like the story that I keep hearing is that basically other people who are non-religious but are kind and tolerant ask you the right questions, and then you start to wonder. Do you think that's kind of similar to your experience?
A little bit. I mean, again, like I said, one of the big things that kind of sparked my journey outside of the Christian belief was that conversation I had with my friend, who just brought up one random piece of information about how scientists are looking into the past of the universe that I just had no idea about. And I mean, I do think my parents did a great job as far as like getting us outside of at least the Southern bubble. We did a lot of travel. I went to the Grand Canyon when I was 12. I went to the UK when I was 12.
That's cool.
Yeah, my oldest sister, Elizabeth, she ended up going to Oxford University for college.
Wow.
So, yeah, she got her master's in chemistry there, ended up going to Germany for a little while in an attempt to get her PhD in chemical engineering. Like very, very brilliant woman. But because of that, both my older siblings and then me, my parents, my grandparents, we all went to England and Scotland for 2 weeks to drop my sister off, but also just to get that cultural experience. And that definitely opened my eyes to just beginning to understand that there is a world even outside of America that just has totally different points of views. Everyone sees things in their own way that are ways that I had never even begun to think could have existed. So my parents definitely did a good job at making sure that we weren't just inside the home, because again, we were homeschooled, but they still made sure we were out and amongst people. We were getting experiences that were helping us learn to treat people the right way.
Right. And what I like about how you're describing the way that you were raised in your parents' household is they did not seem at all afraid that you would leave the faith. You know, I feel like a lot of our Christian friends, their parents kind of squashed them because they were afraid if they gave them any leniency, they would go. And I feel like your parents, it sounds like they did a great job of not at least outwardly being scared that you would leave them behind, and instead giving you the opportunity to like explore and learn and decide kind of on your own.
In some aspects, yes. In others, especially when it came to the media we were allowed to consume, that was a whole different story. Literally, so I never grew up watching Bill Nye the Science Guy. I watched Beekman's World instead, because Bill Nye the Science Guy talked a lot about evolution. And my parents were very firmly against evolution. I don't know if you've ever heard of the ministry Answers in Genesis, but we grew up. Okay, so have you heard of the Creation Museum in Kentucky?
Yes, I have.
They're the people behind the Creation Museum. They're the people behind the Noah's Ark experience.
Oh no, Ark experience. Oh no.
I honestly want to get a group of comedians together to go and tour that thing and vlog just like the whole thing.
Well, I was going to say, please vlog. Yes. I am on board. Please let me know.
We grew up on a lot of their media. I mean, they literally would write, like there was a guy named Buddy Davis who would write songs about creationism and about how evolution was going to taint our point of view, basically. And so that was stuff that we actually grew up watching and listening to and consuming. The Trinity Broadcasting Network, they every Saturday had their kids club. And that's what we would watch on Saturdays instead of cartoons. And we were watching, I hope there are people out here who know what this is, but like shows like Quigley's Village, which was all puppets, and it was a dude who would go around interacting with these puppets as if he was living in a town.
Like Christian Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, basically. And there was another one, Bill Gunter, U.S. Marshal. There was a pastor out of Oklahoma named Willie George, and he had a children's series about this U.S. Marshal in the 1890s out in the West, and he was a Christian marshal who became the sheriff of a town, and so all of his dealings with people were very influenced by his relationship with God. To the point, Kenneth Copeland, who has now become very famous for trying to blow COVID away during a group prayer session, he played a character in that. Like, I grew up as a young child with Kenneth Copeland as a very big part of the media I was consuming, but not him as a pastor, him as a former gunslinger. So it's literally like it's.
I'm going to YouTube this immediately.
Yes,
because I did not know
YouTube that, and you need to YouTube Commander Kelly and the Super Kids, because that was Kenneth Copeland's ministry. where his daughter played the leader of this group of Jesus crime fighting kids. Like, yeah, this was a lot of the stuff that we were growing up
How did
watching.
I miss this? I feel like my parents didn't do a very good job at all now.
I have met one person in my life who knows what I'm talking about with any of this stuff. And the only reason he knows is because he quite literally grew up right across the border in Texas from where they were filming all this stuff. Wow. So he just, by proximity and also growing up Christian, just knew what all this was. But he's the only person I've ever met who knows what any of this is.
That's wild.
Yeah.
I gotta
at the same time
process that.
Some of it was actually really good because I grew up through the media I was consuming, and I feel like it's very relevant today with the understanding that all humans are loved equally by God, no matter what they look like. There was even an episode on racism that Bill Gunter had, where the pastor got up before the story started and literally said, okay, everybody, I have to warn you, we are to use a racial slur in this episode, but we are using it to show you how horrific it is to treat someone who looks different from you, to treat them this way. He's like, we do not endorse saying the N-word. We never recommend that anyone says it. And we want you to have conversations with your kids about why it's wrong to treat people different. Yeah. And so while I feel like some kids who grew up very fundamental never got that kind of talking to, most of the media we were consuming actually made very sure to teach us God loves everyone the same. You can't treat someone different just because they look different or grew up different.
That's so wild, because I feel like there is this unfair stereotype of the Southern conservative Christian also being racist, also being bigoted. And that, like, I didn't grow up with that experience. Clearly you didn't grow up with that experience. So I think it's great that those kind of shows existed where it's like, hey, we're teaching you all these religious things, but we're also teaching you that, like, God loves everybody, just like the Bible says. Exactly. That's interesting. I would be curious, though, to talk to their creator about that show, the creator of that show, about how they feel about homosexualdy. I would be curious. I'm sure they're very against it. Right. I would be curious to see, like, hey, treat everyone the same. What about gays? Whoa, like, slow your roll.
Well, I mean, on that, like I said, because I mean, I've always hated this phrase, but there was always that phrase, hate the sin, love the sinner. Yes. And while my family never really used that phrase, it was very much believed that, again, no matter who the person is, no matter where they've come from, no matter how they're living their lives, God loves them. And we need to at least treat them with respect, whether or not we agree with their choices. Right. And I was talking to somebody about that the other day, that exact phrase, and we both agreed that we had only ever heard it used in terms of homosexuality. Like, while the message was meant probably to be broader than that, we both had only ever heard it come up when it was talking about gay people. Well, I would say we definitely heard it a lot in terms of, like, adultery or living with a significant other before you get married, or that kind of stuff. Scandalous, I know. Scandal. But yeah. So, I mean, it definitely, at least in my experience, was applied to a more broad set of scenarios. But the vast majority of times, I would agree, it's definitely in reference to homosexuality. Right. And so what would you say are some things that you still carry with you that you feel like were maybe initially introduced to you or taught to you by religion? And then what are the things that you have rejected from your religious teaching and upbringings? Is there anything that you are still practicing, or that you still believe that you were taught as a religious? That is a very good question. As far as stuff that I have left behind, I'm definitely nowhere near as conservative as I used to be. I don't view the world through this limited bubble of laws and life need to reflect my religious beliefs. I've gotten to a point I would consider myself to be more of a centrist, left-leaning centrist, where I see the world as, we have almost 8 billion people on this planet, and every single one of them has their own ridiculously in-depth story that no one else is ever going to fully be able to understand.
Right.
And so we can't just impose our points of view on other people because that's what we would like to see.
Right.
There are definitely parts of entertainment that I cannot look at anymore or listen to anymore. Musically, I grew up on artists like Jeremy Camp or DC Talk or Skillet. A lot of these Christian, hard rock bands, a few of them I can still go back and listen to, like Reliant K, who was basically the Christians' answer to Blink 182. I still love them. I've gone and seen them live a few times. Switchfoot is one of those bands I can still listen to. I've met John Foreman on a couple of occasions. He's a very wonderful person. He's a very loving person. Like, he genuinely does not care who you are. Just be a good person, be a nice person, and he's so nice to you. But then there's, at the same time, I've watched, like the lead singer of Skillet, John Cooper. They were my favorite band growing up. I've been to their concerts 5 or 6 times. I could sing every single one of their songs. Now he's one of those, like, the very stereotypical screaming white man in a podcast where he's just sitting by himself, not even talking to people. He's just ranting at the screen for 45 minutes. And it's like, I look back on that and I'm like, wow, I consumed the things he was saying, and now I'm so horrified by some of the things he's saying. So definitely a lot of the influences I've had to leave behind. As far as things that I still keep around and like still cling to, I would say the biggest thing is, that show Veggie Tales.
Yeah.
Whether or not I believe in God anymore, anyone believes in God anymore, the one thing I will always hold with me is the fact that every time they ended one of their shows, they looked straight at the camera and said, God made you special and he loves you very much. Yes. And to me, that influence of understanding that every person is worthy of love and respect, no matter, they can do terrible things. And yeah, we should be upset when people do terrible things, but we also need to understand that eventually people can change if you show them how to change.
Yes.
Instead of just being angry that someone did the wrong thing.
Yes.
Why don't we take some time and help them understand why it was wrong and why something else can be a better thing to do?
Yes. I think that's so important. And I think that's so important even outside of religious belief or faith. Yeah. I think our world and our society has fostered this narrative that you can never come back from the things you did or the things you said. And what we don't realize we're doing is we're stunting our own growth. Mm-hmm. Because I would trust somebody so much more entirely who used to be one way and is willing to admit that they were wrong and they no longer believe those things than somebody who tries to manipulate it to sound like they're still the same person, but it's kind of like when you ask somebody who they voted for and when they're honest and they're like, I literally voted for this person because they're not the other person. Yeah. I trust that person so much more than people who try to pretend they actually back up some of the things this person did and said that they don't actually believe. Exactly. And so I'm so glad you said that, because I think allowing people the opportunity to say, I used to be this person. I know that I used to say these things and post these things and start arguments about these things and tout these things, but I feel differently now. I feel like that's one of the most important messages we can teach the generations below us and above us. I think nobody's too old for that message as well. Like, hey, you used to be a piece of shit, but you're not anymore. And you're willing to admit you were wrong back in the day.
Well, it's like this whole attitude that I keep seeing from people who they're like, oh, well, my grandpa's racist, so screw him. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with him. I'm like, that's the wrong way to look at it.
That is the wrong way.
Sure, you shouldn't let yourself be influenced by something that bad, but if you really care about that person, you should put the time into trying to help them see what is truth. Right, and not just write them off as something terrible. Obviously, if you give someone opportunity after opportunity and they continue to show you who they are and who they're going to continue to be, that's not something you can ever change.
Right.
But if
right.
you really care about someone, why would you just abandon them?
Right. And it's, it's different if, say, the person's toxicity is like negatively impacting you and it's unhealthy for you.
Yes.
But again, that comes with chances and opportunity, right? So
Exactly.
you give them a chance, they're toxic. You give them another chance, they're toxic. It's like, okay, we're like, I've made my message clear. And if they are interested in learning more, they can come to me. But I think you're right. I think we are very quick to write people off when I know personally, if people had written me off, I would be much different than I am today.
Oh,
right.
Absolutely.
Even as old as 23, 24, 25, I truly thought that I was a certain way and I believed a certain thing. And like I mentioned earlier, tolerant, kind people just asked me the right questions.
Yeah.
They stuck around and they asked me the right questions and they gave me the opportunity to change. And they didn't say, told you so, or I knew it. They were just like, oh, dope. That's cool. You don't believe that? Great. We don't either. Yeah. So, welcome to the club.
Exactly.
Do you feel like religious upbringing had a negative impact on you as an adult in any way?
I aspects of it did. And this is where I'm going to clarify. For the longest time, I had the hardest time separating what my parents actually taught me and what the influence of other people I was around taught me.
Right. Big difference.
Yeah, because for the longest time, I would, have and especially this started coming out as I started moving away from these mindsets. My brain would just be like, oh, well, this is what my parents taught me growing up, and it's so wrong. I can't believe they believe that. But then when I actually had the conversation with my parents, they were like, we never said that.
Yeah.
And that's when I started to realize, oh, this came from other people or media that I was consuming that was very Christian.
Right.
A good example of this, Focus on the Family. I grew up listening to a radio drama series that they had called Adventures in Odyssey. And a lot of times—
I remember that.
Yeah. It actually is kind of the reason why I ended up getting into audio engineering, was because
you've like unlocked a memory in my brain that I haven't thought about in 20 years.
Yeah. And for the most part, I'd say that show was relatively harmless. I think it was a fun adventure on a lot of things. But when they started getting hardcore into preaching their own ideologies, because it was an approved, media source that I was allowed to consume, eventually it got to the point where I couldn't differentiate from, well, this is what Dr. James Dobson believes, and this is what my parents believe.
Right.
And so as time has gone on, I've been able to separate those negative things that I saw growing up. I mean, especially when it came to the way that a lot of other people treated other people in Christianity. Like, you would have these big battles between like Southern Baptist and different levels of Protestantism and Episcopalians, and all these hundreds of different denominations literally fighting over why the other one was preaching bad ideologies and why we're the ones that are correct. When I'm just like, aren't we all on the same team?
Right.
Shouldn't we all be agreeing on the one thing that is supposed to unify us all together? And I think all of that infighting especially led to me looking at, especially the way the world is today, just how everyone on every side of every issue is doing nothing but screaming at each other and calling each other racist on both sides. I see conservatives calling liberals racist all the time. I see liberals calling conservatives racist all the time. And I'm just like, but guys, do you not understand that we're literally just pushing ourselves further apart? Instead of being able to have the conversation. Like you were saying earlier, if you question things to some people, they would get defensive and angry. And why are you questioning this thing? When my parents, on the other hand, were the ones, if we had a question, even if it was a hard question, at the very least, the answer we would get is, I don't know. But it was the honesty of being able to say, I don't know the answer to this. Let me figure that out and come back to you. Like
absolutely.
That level of honesty, I think, has definitely influenced the way that I look at the world now.
Yes. And I think there is a dangerous toxicity behind people in any form of power, but especially religion, because people tend to absorb it so much. There's this toxicity in when people ask a question and the people they're asking do not admit when they don't know, and instead go off on this tangent where either they're just saying lies, it's just not true, or they are kind of giving like a long-winded HR answer, and by the time they're done, the person still has that question where they're like, wait, what did you just say? I think there's something so important about being able to say, I don't know. And I think there's a respect and an admiration there. I much rather admire people who seek information and knowledge that they don't have than people who supposedly know everything.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was probably the biggest mistake of like the pandemic, was the fact that no one in leadership in this country would simply say, we don't know what the hell's going on.
We don't know.
This is brand new. And the fact that everyone kept saying, no, this is exactly how it is. And then 2 weeks later, they found out new information and then just decided to pretend that, oh no, it's been this way the whole time. I'm just like, no, just please tell us you don't know, so that we can all be on the same page.
Yeah, please.
We'll trust you more if you just don't make something up.
Yes, exactly. And I think that is especially toxic in religion because, you know, some people make politics their identity, some people don't. Some people make, you know, their career, whether they're in medicine or something, their entire personality. So some people don't. But religion is so much of people's identity and personality and existence that when they're being taught by people who aren't teaching, when they're being taught by people who aren't willing to admit they don't know, to me, that is dangerous.
Yeah. I saw that attitude a lot, especially from pastors growing up. To compare, so for the longest time, we didn't really have a church. So we would go to the church my grandmother was going to. It was a 30, 40-minute drive away, but we knew people there. And so at least there was a little bit of a community there. But the pastor at that church, an elderly man, a doctor of theology, he had this attitude of, I'm the pastor, I'm the guy on stage, I'm the one who knows, and you're the one who's learning. And so I am the one on stage teaching you what you should learn. After that church, we took a couple of years off from going to church consistently because we were all just burnt out. We could not, we were just done. But we discovered the church that my parents are still going to now. And the one thing that I loved about that church was the fact that Steve, and he refused to be called Pastor Steve, because there's a verse in the Bible that says, you have no pastor, you have no teacher, you have no father other than God. And so literally he refused. He was just like, I'm the guy who gets on stage every week and talks.
That's a man who has actually read the Bible.
Exactly. And so watching him and seeing his view of, I am not more special than you. Sure, I read this book every day, so I'm more familiar with it than you might be, but I'm not more special than you. I am just the guy who gets up here and tells you the things that I've learned. And if you have questions about it, please come talk to me afterwards, because I would love to have this conversation with you. That attitude changed the way I've ever seen anyone who's put themselves in leadership, because I've had jobs or I've worked with people who saw themselves as all that and refused to accept that they're just another person. But then I've had other people that I've worked for that are just the most down-to-earth people. They're the first ones to say, I don't know, let's go figure this out. Let's figure out how to do this thing. And those are the people that I've always enjoyed working for.
Yes, 100%. Especially the people who have that attitude of, let's learn together, right?
Yes.
Like, we're learning this thing together, as opposed to, I knew the whole time this was the answer, I just didn't want to tell you, or something like that.
Exactly. You had to figure it out for yourself.
Yeah, I can't hold your hand and do everything for you. You know, I can't teach you anything. That's interesting. And do you think that your parents have changed over the years in terms of maybe how conservative they used to be versus how conservative they are? Are they pretty consistent in their beliefs?
They still believe in the God of the Bible, but I think their views of other people is what's changed the most. Like I said, I have a trans sister, and I'm not going to go all into that because I don't want to speak for her, but that situation was very traumatic for everyone in my family. From the way that we all found out, which was definitely not the ideal way that the information should have come to us. It was another person who was being very malicious in their telling of us, and it was just not awful. A good situation. Yeah. And so since that, though, as we've been able to process the trauma itself, my parents especially, I feel like have gotten to a point where they're able to look at the situation objectively, and their now number one concern is my child happy and healthy?
Yes.
And that, I think, is probably the biggest thing I've ever seen them do, because they went from being gay is a sin, hands down, no arguments, to, oh, well, maybe you're not choosing to live a sinful lifestyle. Maybe this is genuinely what your brain is telling you to do. Right. And they have taken a little bit more of a scientific approach to it than just flat out being like, well, you're wrong because of this.
Right. And I think a lot of people who maybe in the past, especially say, for example, the boomer generation, I think what changes a lot of their opinions the most is when it impacts the people they love. So it's easy to say, gays are going to hell. If you do this certain lifestyle, you're going to hell. If you're that certain lifestyle, you're going to hell. But then you meet people that are good and kind, and you love them, and they're wonderful, and they're giving, and they are gay or they are trans, and they start to think to themselves, would God really send this person to hell? Yeah. This person who has done so much. And I think that opens a lot of people's eyes in terms of, do I want to serve a God who would send this person to hell? Right. And I think that's where a lot of like the people who tend to lean atheist and agnostic kind of go, because they're like, I don't want to serve a God who's going to say that. Or they start to think maybe the way that things are supposed to be is a little bit more relaxed than I initially thought. Exactly. maybe because this person is saved, because this person has been baptized, maybe just because they're living this lifestyle that might be considered, unbiblical, maybe they'll be okay. Like maybe
something my parents definitely hammered into our heads growing up that a lot of other Christians I don't think understood was this idea of when you're saved, because most other fundamentalist sects that I came into contact with very much were into the idea of backsliding, or of that you need to basically re-up your subscription to Jesus every few months, because you did something, therefore clearly you need to rededicate your life to the Lord. And my parents never really subscribed to that ideology. To them, it was more, no, God says, I accept you here now, who you are, even if you don't progress in the direction, because to them it was always, well, you can live your life, or you can live the best life that God wants for you. Right. And so to them, if you change your life, it was just moving more in the ideal life direction that God had for you. Right. Other Christians, to them, it was a constant struggle of, am I still worthy? Am I still good enough? And a lot of the songs that we would sing growing up in church, especially, just had to do with this idea that we are broken, we are nothing, and without you, we're nothing. Well, my parents, I think, wanted us to understand that an individual relationship has nothing to do with how the rest of the world views you. You and God are on your own journey. Therefore, that's all between you. You shouldn't have to sit here and constantly be begging for the Spirit of the Lord to come down, because he's already with you. Right. And I think a lot of times that belief system that you have to reignite, you have to re-up your subscription, that to me, that's almost the antithesis of what the Bible actually says. Exactly. And I wonder sometimes if that comes from guilt, like from what I have read in the Bible, once you are saved, you are saved. There is no getting unsaved. It just doesn't happen.
and you are forgiven for your sins, right? It's touted as a good idea to still ask for forgiveness if you continue to sin. But
Sure.
I wonder if some very, very conservative religious people think that they do something. Maybe they kiss somebody they're not married to. Maybe they have sex outside of marriage. And they think to themselves, this is such a bad thing that there's no way that I'm still going to heaven. It's gotta be that I lost my salvation and I have to get it back. Right. Yep. There's just no way. And it's sad to me because that idea of unconditional love is supposed to be the whole thing behind Christianity. And it makes you wonder if their religion made them feel like the love was actually very conditional. Did their family also make them feel like love was very conditional? Right. I feel like in a lot of very fundamentalist families, the love is conditional. And that's why people get disowned when they leave the church and things like that, because it kind of embodies that same, you always need to be constantly asking for forgiveness and acceptance.
Yeah. Well, I know you said that growing up, you at least were around the Duggars and knew the Duggars. I knew a family who also had like 18, 19 kids. I'm not going to name them. I'm not into doxing or anything like that, but I remember when one of their older kids was in their early 20s, she was trying to get out of the household because she started to understand a lot of really abusive practices, especially mentally abusive practices that were going on within the family. And the dad would do this thing where he would make the kids feel guilty about not being independent, but would also make it literally impossible for them to be independent. He had her working for his ministry, his company, but if she didn't do everything exactly the way that he demanded it be done, he would dock her pay. He just wouldn't pay her for the day. So all of her money was controlled by her dad. And it literally took her just saying, no, I don't care. I am leaving. I'm finding somewhere else to live with one of my other siblings. And I'm just making this happen for her to be able to start understanding how to be independent. And that's where I think it comes into, he definitely was making her feel like the only way I'll accept you is if you do things the way that I am telling you to do it. Right. I think a lot of people have that view of God, where God is that figure who's always breathing down your neck, who's just like, that's not what I said to do in the Bible. You got to do it this way. And so, I wholeheartedly agree. That's where that whole idea of backsliding comes in. A lot of people feel like, oh, I backslid on my faith this week. I yelled at someone, got to go ask Jesus for forgiveness again. Yeah. And I think it's such a toxic way to like treat people.
Right. And I think Catholics I think they're at least a step in the right direction with confession, because I do feel like there is something to be said about getting stuff off your chest that's healthy. Sure. I don't think the whole punishment for it and like God is watching you do all this, so I don't think that's healthy, but I do get the idea of if you did something bad, like maybe get it off your chest and tell somebody in private that you trust about it.
Well, I think the idea of community, like true community, open and honest friendships, like close friendships, isn't spoken about enough with Christians. It's always in the context of like, oh, we have our Bible study and this is where we all admit our faults and this is where we all like repent again to Jesus, as opposed to just saying, hey, you should have two really close friends in your life that if you're struggling with something, or if you've done something stupid or screwed up, you have people that you can be honest with and say, hey, this is what happened. Please help me get a different set of eyes on this situation so I can figure out what the right thing to do is.
Right. And I remember it being in like youth group and teen and college age groups, how it was almost kind of a martyrdom to come forward and be like, I sinned this week. And it's like the most popular person in the youth group. And you're like, wow, they sinned. And they're telling us, oh, wow. So it's bad because you're like, part of me feels like, you should get stuff off your chest. And then part of me knows that it very quickly becomes a contest.
It's some crazy emotional manipulation.
It is. Have you?
Go ahead.
No, sorry.
I was just going to say, I feel like in some ways it's kind of made me a little bit better of a storyteller, in film or in comedy, because I kind of know the emotional beats that it takes to get people from point A to point F. And I know all the little beats in between.
Yes.
And so it's weird how that has kind of, in some ways, positively affected me wanting to tell stories that are fully fictitious, fully made up, but still bring people on a journey. So it's almost like I've been able to get something good out of such a terrible experience.
Yes. And I always try to clarify with people, because I also agree that it's kind of a terrible experience. But I also try to clarify with people, like, I know that I met really amazing people through the church, and I don't at all think that it's a parental fault for introducing me to the church, because I feel like that was an attempt to parent me well and to save my soul and my salvation and take care of me. But I do think we need to, and the reason I have this podcast is we do need to talk about the responsibility that these churches have and the trauma that they can cause. Like, I know lots of people who went to amazing churches growing up, great, but we need to talk about how damaging purity culture is. We need to talk about how damaging these messages are, that even though they don't say hate gays, they kind of say hate gays in a lot of churches, right? And we also need to talk about the irresponsibility that comes between when a person in the pulpit starts to talk politics. That is irresponsible and that is dangerous, and they should be separated. And so I always want to clarify that, like, this podcast is not about like, yo, fuck religion, because I've seen religion do a lot of good things for a lot of good people. And I know a lot of beautiful, amazing, wonderful people who are religious, but we need to at least address the trauma and the problems and the responsibility and the irresponsibility of a lot of the actions and beliefs that are being like spread, I guess, that are being taught to so many people. And we need to admit that a lot of wars were caused because of religion in the name of God. We need to admit that. And so I think people oftentimes feel bad about talking about the traumas that come with faith, because that seems to them like they're abandoning their family or they're abandoning their loved ones who are religious, when in reality, I feel like it could help a lot of people if more of us were willing to at least talk about it.
Well, speaking of purity culture, I got to say, I do have a lot of respect for Josh Harris coming out and literally taking his book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, out of print. Yeah. He said, I have gone back over this book and have realized the amount of trauma I have caused countless number of especially women, because I know a lot of women growing up who were forced to read that book. I was also forced to read it. And it's not, that I think my parents were doing anything malicious to them. No. This whole idea was the right thing to do. And just because they took bad advice doesn't mean that they were trying to do anything malicious. Right. But the fact that he's been able to come out and admit that this was not something that was good, I think I just have so much respect for the fact that he did that. Yes.
Prime example of what we were talking about earlier, of somebody who should be allowed to come out and say, I know that I said this, I published this, I made money off this was my brand, this was my face, and I'm so sorry. Yeah. And I don't even know what else to say about that, because I was wrong, and people like that. And like, our parents were indoctrinated the same way we were. Right. So they thought they were doing the right thing. They probably still think they're doing the right thing. Their parents thought they were doing the right thing. So it's not even a, like, fuck boomers for, no, because literally everybody just thinks they're doing the right thing because of what they've been told. And it's just taken a few generations for us to be willing to out loud be like, this doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, to come to like a good resolution, my parents and I, over the last 10 years, have had so many conversations about the things they could have done better, the things they absolutely should not have done in the first place. Yep. Also, especially when it came to just like the way that they disciplined us and the way that they treated us when we were in trouble, instead of in some situations trying to, like you said earlier, use it as a teaching moment, it just became about discipline. And the fact of the matter is, we've had the conversations, and my parents have both said, we had no one to show us how to do this.
Right.
We had no one to show us how to raise kids in what they considered to be a godly way. And
Right.
so along the way, they just took bad advice from potentially well-meaning people,
Right.
but it was just all that they knew. And
Right.
so as time has gone on, and even growing up, I did begin to see a shift as far as how they would punish us and how they would treat us. But especially over the last several years, those conversations and hearing my parents both be able to say, we're sorry we took this bad advice. I wish I could go back and change it. From here forward, I just want to help you in any way that I can.
Right.
That has been so healing for all of us.
Yes.
To be able to hear that from them.
Right. And I think that takes just as much, I want to say bravery, I guess, like that takes just as big of balls to come out and be like, look, I know that I wasn't perfect. Please let me know how I can help you now. And to be able to kind of walk back some of the things that they might have touted, so thoroughly. I remember my mom, one day we were in the car. It was the summer before I went away to college. And she looked at me and she's like, look, I got to tell you some things that I wasn't supposed to tell you when you were young, because you're just not supposed to tell this to young people. But realistically, she's like, I know you're going to college. I know you're going to meet boys. I know these things, and I just want you to know that I think it's important that you live with somebody before you marry them. And I was like, what? What? Because my parents were both virgins when they got married. And my mom has joked her whole life that she thinks that's why so many people came, because they'd never seen two people that were virgins get married and they just wanted to witness it. But she was like, I grew up in a different time. And I think she said with, divorce on the rise, the way that it is, I think it's really important they get to know people and you live with them before you're married. And I was like, holy shit. And then she was like, also, I just ask that you wait until you're like 25 to start like having sex with all these guys, please just get, and I just remember being like, whoa, you're allowed to do that? Like you're allowed to just be an adult and then turn around and be like, okay, now that you're grown up, we can talk, and I think that's exactly the kind of thing that I think people need to do more often, is be like, okay, I had to be strict when you were little because I didn't want you to mess around. But now that we're adults, we can have this conversation. Let's open the floor. Let's have this conversation. And I wish that the college age groups in church would do more of that. Yeah. I wish they would do more of that.
Well, like recently, so my baby sister just turned 18. Holy crap.
Wow.
And it came out in a conversation that I've done mushrooms before.
Hell
she
yeah.
looked at me and was just like, you lied to me? And I was like, hell no, I am not telling a 15-year-old girl that I have been doing hallucinogenics. God, no, I'm not just going to treat that as something that's super casual and fun for you to do.
No.
I'm like, no, I have to be at least a little responsible and wait till you're a certain age before I'm like, oh yeah, I've done this.
Yeah. Like I feel like shrooms changed my life and made me a more intelligent person. I'm not about to tell the kids I babysit.
Yeah.
That,
I mean, if we can go on a quick shrooms tangent, the first time I did them, I went camping with a friend of mine. And for me, I know for a lot of people with mushrooms, it can be so different depending upon which strain and who you are and
where you're at. Yeah.
For me, I had a lot of trauma from growing up. I had a lot of trauma from a past relationship and just a lot of mental abuse that came along with that. And so as my friend is sitting there like describing how he's feeling on mushrooms so that I can start looking and trying to feel those things, as the night went on, we're literally laying in the middle of a field looking up at the stars. And for like an hour, neither one of us said a single word, because I was sitting there processing like my entire life and all this terrible trauma and all this horrific shit that I'd gone through. And I finally, at the end of this big, long, like, some people are like, my life flashed before my eyes as I was dying. It felt kind of like that. I just saw everything in this linear timeline, and it got to me laying in that field, looking at the stars. And I just thought, well, it's all in the past. I guess I just got to move on. And that was like the first big step I was able to take to move on from a lot of
this. Yes, 100%. And I always highly encourage people in a safe environment with people they
Yes.
trust to experience these things. And I always tell them, not when you're not ready, right? Like some people that like, not when you're not ready. But before I took shrooms, I was a conservative Republican Christian.
Yeah.
And when I woke up the next day, I was a liberal atheist Democrat. Because what happened, like in my experience, what happened was I started thinking of all these questions that I had never thought of before. And, you know, when you're high on weed and you write down questions, you wake up the next day and you're like, that's the dumbest shit I've ever seen in my life. But I was like writing down all these questions, and most of them were about like religion and God, because I had already kind of been questioning how much I actually believed up until then. And the next morning, they were still really good questions.
Yeah.
And I was like, this whole time, I thought I believed this. I thought I believed that. And it really just helped me understand. I was just regurgitating what I was being fed. And upon reflection and research, I didn't actually believe any of those things.
Yeah.
And it was just wild. But I would never tell a 14-year-old that story.
Exactly.
I would never do it. I would be like, oh, you're feeling kind of confused. Okay, well, like do research, figure out who you are, express yourself. And then
maybe go microdose.
Right. And then when you're 21, come see me and I've got a present for you.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's, I'm so glad you said that, because what a game changer. Yeah. What a game changer. But again,
seriously.
Microdose is the key word there.
Well, for me, I didn't like macrodose, and definitely I have not done hero's dose, especially. But like,
no.
That night I was with someone who had done them hundreds of times, and was just like,
same.
This is a good dose. You may see some stuff. You may confront some things within you, but it's not going to put you into the depths of hell.
Right.
So
right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was definitely a very positive experience.
Yeah. Cause I feel like the movies, when they show like acid trips or shroom trips, it's always like, I'm holding a knife. I might do it. And it's like, it's all,
that person's an octopus.
You're literally sitting on a couch with a snack thinking like, am I Christian? I don't know. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. And then the next day you're just zapped. You're just emotionally drained.
Yeah.
But man, that's wild. I got to get you on my other podcast to talk about shrooms sometime, because I feel there's an entire Pandora's box. I have had
some great times.
I attribute shrooms to so much of who I am today and who I've become. And I honestly worry sometimes about who I would be had I never tried them. I do worry about that sometimes. I think, and I fear for that version of me out there in some linear universe. But man, well, this was great. I really appreciate talking to you. If you had something that you wanted to say to somebody who, say, for example, they're listening to this and they're teetering on that fence between, maybe they still think they're religious, maybe they're interested in exploring being non-religious, what would you say to somebody who is confused and wondering where to go next?
I would definitely say truth should be what you're looking for. Don't look for something to disprove that God exists, and don't look for something to just validate the feelings that you're having. Make truth what you're looking for. Go after it, and don't be afraid to still believe that there is a God, but also don't be afraid to change your mind. Go find the truth and let that dictate how you think instead of the other way around.
Wow. That's such a good message. I love the way you worded that. I feel like a lot of people want that, but they don't know how to articulate it in the way that you just did. I love that. Don't look for what you're looking for. Let the truth be what you find, right? Yeah. Like don't go out there searching to prove yourself right. Go out there willing to accept if perhaps what you find is the opposite of what you might have thought.
Exactly.
I like that. I love that. Well, Seth, where can we find your content? Where can we see you? What are you promoting? Anything at the moment? Do you have a website?
So, don't have a website yet. I do have 4 comedy shows coming up in March.
Nice.
One on the 6th. There's one, the date is still being figured out, but I'll be posting all of this to my my comedy page. It's Seth Kays Comedy on Facebook and Instagram. And you can also follow me at Man-Made Media Co. on Instagram. That's my overall just personal and art page. But I have a show that I'm going to be hosting at Up Down on March 23rd. And then I am producing and hosting a comedy show at Honey Tree Meadery in East Nashville on March 25th.
So you're busy is what you're saying. We could see you all over the place.
Getting there, trying to be as busy as I can. So
that's awesome. Well, Seth, thank you so much for being a part of my podcast. I really appreciate your time and your opinions and your thoughts. And I wish you the best, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this. I would love to do it again sometime.
Of course.
Yeah.
And see.